On Twitter, there are many accounts who post numerous photos of Europe and traditional architecture. You'll discover the Loire Valley, German university towns, Edinburgh, Prague, and other delightful places in Europe among these accounts, as well as calls to valorize tradition and to return to beauty. When complemented with online aesthetic movements like royalty core and dark academia, and increasing interest into the Catholic Latin Mass and Orthodox Christianity, we can determine these aesthetic accounts complement our current philosophical and theological concerns quite well. If you look onto my Twitter page, you'll encounter many of my retweets of these accounts, and in my videos, I've certainly focused on curating the very best of Western architecture and art. I am not ashamed to admit this. I adore beauty and beautiful places. There's just something so enchanting about a Bavarian castle, palace in St. Petersburg, or an art gallery with Renaissance sculpture in Florence. One of my favourite thinkers of contemporary times, the sorely missed Roger Scruton, understood my protests against the uglification of our cities and landscapes quite well. But Scruton, like myself, and like these aesthetic accounts on X, coded as conservative and even reactionary. There's some truth here, but ever since these aesthetic accounts gained popularity, there have been sharp and oftentimes deeply uncharitable accusations leveled towards us. First, it was a hysterical label of white supremacy and the cliched, "You are misrepresenting the past." But in the past few years, the comments have turned to vicious language about being shallow, kitschy, and live-action role-playing as traditional. I see these comments not only in magazines, but all throughout the internet, and even in some of the audience feedback I've received. Not everyone has to share my tastes. There are certainly many misconceptions about trad aesthetics, and broadly speaking, traditional architecture and art. So, I want to set the record straight about beauty and beautiful places, but more importantly, the people who love them. Here, I'll address the many critiques and articulate the reasons why many like myself are drawn to Europe of old. It is not about feeling superior, or being naive, or trying to hurt anyone. I'll end this video on a positive note by referencing some of my favourite architectural designs from the 1980s onwards. But for now, let's defend beauty and traditional architecture. I'm Madeline Rose Jones, and I explore history, literature, and culture. Welcome to Snowy Fictions. When art is discussed, there is usually the retort, taste is subjective, and the implication that one's aesthetic preference doesn't trump another. Certainly truth in that. My appreciation for classical and Gothic architecture is simply not shared by everyone, and if I want to convince others of the merits of building in my preferred style, I need to take that into account, the subjective nature of art. Honestly, I believe advocates for traditional architecture do a massive disservice when they try to argue that objective beauty is real, or that beauty is quantified and measured. While I'm not entirely unsympathetic to this view, I just do not agree. Beauty can take multiple forms, and two vastly different styles can still have beauty. This is not the same as morality, where you can argue that one action is superior to not doing it or doing something else. In fact, much of the charm of beauty is that it can't be quantified or articulated easily. Simply, beauty runs in its own way, but, like goodness, can both surprise us and reveal itself in the most curious places. Beauty, as well as goodness, comes from both the divine and human sources. Traditional architecture has always been beautiful to me. The stained glass in a French cathedral illuminates light in a captivating way, and I find myself emotionally moved and stirred while in these spaces. If you've ever been to Europe, you would have visited these splendid buildings, whether ancient, medieval, or modern. I may lack the proper language to describe what beauty is, but I can certainly declare that traditional architecture is beautiful, while still being aware that it is my opinion and perhaps not everyone shares it. So, it is prudent to argue for traditional architecture with a different tactic. European and Western countries should return to traditional architecture because we have conclusive evidence that it is beloved and treasured. Simply, tradition works. The designs I propose are also deeply rooted in the respective countries and civilizations. It makes sense for my country, Australia, to use Federation and neo-medieval designs as they are symbolic and representative of Australian civilization. Also, it makes sense for the United States to use neoclassical architecture for government buildings, not because they are objectively beautiful, but because neoclassical aesthetics capture the American soul. Art history has always been married to culture, and the buildings the society commissions must represent the specific people. And it's just true that certain styles, aesthetics, materials, shapes, and patterns embody that. I live in Sydney, a city which, frankly, could benefit from more beautiful buildings, particularly in the western suburbs. Yet the Auburn Gallipoli Mosque was built to match the many treasures in the Ottoman Empire, particularly those built under Suleiman the Magnificent. This historical context embodies the many Turkish Muslims who worship at the mosque, many of whom live close by. Art history is full of these stories. Architecture is the way as to which civilizations express themselves. So, traditional architecture and established styles, best way to do this. We know Gothic cathedral is suggestive of the Middle Ages and the Latin West, particularly in England and France. The key theme of this section was beauty. To tie it all back into that topic, I think there is an inherent beauty in any building when it represents a people, an idea, or a nation well. When you encounter Notre-Dame de Paris, Red Square in Moscow, or the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, it is hard to not observe the grandeur, the dedication, the splendor. There's a beauty in that ambition, the drive to create greatness, and the sheer love and devotion an artist has towards the craft. The fact a certain family, person, faith, group, or nation are represented too only adds to the great beauty. There's only so much one can say to politically charged rhetoric meant to demoralize and villainize the opponents. I must clarify that not every critic of traditional architecture stoops this low, and that those who argue like this are surely in the minority, but I'll address it regardless. We must note that those who do love traditional architecture and sculpture are politically diverse. I have encountered many from all kinds of political stripes who love traditional architecture and sculpture. The grand museums and halls of Europe are visited by many all across the world. While I'd argue there is a natural conservative leaning to all of this, I can acknowledge that not everyone who loves, say, the Hofburg in Vienna shares my politics. But in the past decade, there have been countless videos and essays about the white lies in Greco-Roman statues and heavy criticism against Donald Trump's executive order in his first presidency concerning neoclassical architecture. But let's take a closer look. A few years ago, many outlets published content saying that the white supremacists were misrepresenting neoclassical and classical sculpture as in ancient Rome because they were actually in colour. And the final part is true. We have significant evidence to suggest that sculptures from antiquity were painted. This forgets that for neoclassical and Baroque sculpture, which comes from the Renaissance to well into modern history, the statues are nearly always white. Whether this was an aesthetic choice or a deliberate misreading of antiquity, you be the judge. Regardless, I struggle to see how ancient sculpture and architecture proves white supremacists wrong in any way. It doesn't prove them right either. And we should honestly stop expecting art history to conform endlessly to our contemporary political concerns. Frankly, I do not understand this desire to make ancient and medieval history seem more progressive than it actually was. That's discussion for another video. Yet the jab that white supremacists are misunderstanding the past will always sound weak, particularly when it comes from those eager to conflate neoclassical styles and tradition with fascism. Finally, there is Trump's executive order about neoclassical architecture for governmental buildings. To say this provoked debate is a serious understatement. Accusations of fascism, propaganda, not understanding architecture, and it being a frivolous concern fueled through the media and the internet. As I stated in the first section, an architectural style often embodies an idea. This is certainly the case for neoclassical architecture in America, which was incredibly common in the 18th and 19th centuries. When politicians and journalists advocate for a certain architectural style rooted in tradition, it's often the quest for beauty, continuing with tradition, remembrance, and connection between the past and the present. I think this applies to Trump well with the executive order. There is one criticism about neoclassical architecture in particular, which are its associations with fascism. While it's certainly true, the National Socialists and Italian fascists held neoclassical architecture in high glory and in fact continued this aesthetic tradition, they do not have a monopoly over the classical world and its modern reception. In fact, neoclassical styles and thinking predate these very 20th century political movements by quite a bit. Regardless of your own opinions, which you are most entitled to hold, try to view architectural history outside of a strict modern political prism. It is more freeing that way. My point isn't to argue that traditional architecture is secretly anti-fascist or that white supremacists are actually misrepresenting the past or something. I don't play that game, and nor do I think so. I call historic architecture and sculpture traditional or classical for a reason. Roger Scruton and many of his followers conservative for a reason. And whilst I accept that anyone can love and appreciate old European buildings and art, I do observe a traditional conservative leaning within them. As implied earlier, this doesn't make conservative arguments more valid than others. They do have a genuine claim over beautiful places and things. I again return to the beginning. It is possible for anyone, regardless of their political leanings or philosophies, to appreciate traditional architecture. We can speculate endlessly about politics and art. Of course we could. Maybe it's wiser to appreciate traditional architecture in its own rights, as beautiful buildings worthy of appreciation, as embodiments of Western civilization, rather than as totems to our political whims. The common criticism of St. Peter's Basilica and the Vatican is the decadence of it all. The Basilica itself is massive, and the Vatican has one of the finest art collections in the world. The various buildings, especially churches and libraries, are lavish with spectacular craftsmanship. This wealth raises a question: why doesn't the Catholic Church sell everything and give it to the poor? Likewise, this criticism is given to European palaces, royal residences, and elaborate castles, especially those built under King Ludwig II of Bavaria. After the tragic Notre-Dame fire in 2019, many who donated were criticised for not giving the money to seemingly more worthy causes. This is frustrating for several reasons. For one, European nations, especially France and Germany, have been utterly generous towards refugees, migrants, and the poor. The various social security programs and extremely high acceptance of refugees, often to the point of stupidity, does not indicate a decadent society, but in fact, one moored to the teachings of Christian democracy. The Catholic Church also runs hundreds of charities and hospitals all across the West, and is certainly not oblivious to the suffering of the poor. The fact the West in general are often charitable and eager to donate their time and money is also relevant. I understand that not every aspect of Western charity and help is a moral good or helpful, and absolutely that is the case. Yet the West is clearly interested in the welfare of others, also happens to have gorgeous buildings and art. After all, they are the rightful owners of these places. There's also a point that maintaining a building long-term can prove more financially rewarding than selling it once. Tourism is a massive industry, particularly in Europe. The opportunities for outreach, public education, and media exposure are immense. I do not consider any of this at all to be superficial. Downstream from this is the idea that traditional architecture and art is superfluous and not worth caring about. Dismissive attitudes like, oh, it's just a building and who cares? Quite prominent, unfortunately, but I'd argue we all stand to benefit from beautiful places and things. Remember, the cities and spaces we interact with daily do shape our mood, and for certain, places like a town hall or a government building, your nation is being represented. Likewise, a church is for God, so why wouldn't it be magnificent? Beauty, we must remember, is a tool to communicate the sublime and the divine. While I cannot provide a strict definition about what beauty is, I can say that I've seen it, and more importantly, been enriched from it. I'd consider every example I mentioned here to embody beauty, but I'd also add that Europe doesn't have a monopoly over it. There is incredible architecture in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Oceania, nor am I dictating a certain style over others. While I am certainly geared towards Baroque and Gothic architecture, I also find beauty in Neoclassical and Imperial styles. That said, European architecture can provide a good framework to understanding the power of beauty. From personal experience, my encounters in Europe with traditional architecture have been incredibly motivating and inspiring. They remind me of the greatness men and women have achieved, and that ambition and glory deserve encouragement. Architecture can enlighten, it can educate, can prove moving, and cause wonder. Overall, we want our countrymen and women to experience these things. Great architecture inspires great people. Art history is never static. Over thousands of years, the aesthetics chosen by civilizations have changed and evolved. No building ever exists in isolation, and art history is always in dialogue with the past, present, and future. The 20th and 21st century has certainly seen some very hideous buildings, but there have been many spectacular builds from the last 30 years, which I will share now. The first one is in Orange County, California. It is a Roman Catholic church called Christ's Cathedral. Previously, it was an evangelical megachurch called the Crystal Cathedral, but was eventually sold to the Diocese of Orange in the early 21st century. It's clearly a modern building with glass furnishings and straight shapes, but what makes it truly remarkable is how the Catholic liturgy is fitted into this space. There are shrines, small statues, collections of bells, gardens, and of course crosses. It's not to everyone's taste, and is probably an odd pick on a video about traditionalism, but I find the interior spellbinding and completely suitable for sunny Southern California. In Europe, I adore the massive Orthodox cathedrals being built in Romania, Serbia, Georgia, and Russia. You can find these in capital cities such as Bucharest, Belgrade, Tbilisi, and Moscow. And while usually in the Neo-Byzantine style, they are truly wonderful as well as being grand and in some cases record-breaking. October last year, I visited the new cathedral in Tbilisi, Georgia, and it was so majestic, with the cross-lined pathways, the stairs, and the crosses perched outside. I'll also give a special note to the Cathedral of the Armed Forces in Patriot Park, Moscow, because of how inventive and original it is. The fusion of metal and World War II as well as Soviet imagery to the Russo-Byzantine style. I think this is the key to neo-traditional architecture, have touches of both the past and the present. And for that, the Cathedral of the Armed Forces is excellent. Restoration and rebuilding projects also deserve a mention, with key ones being Budapest, Hungary, and Dresden, Germany. The designs in these cases are centuries old, but are given a new life in the 21st century. This is also the case in Russia, where once demolished Orthodox cathedrals have been rebuilt, whereas others have been restored to their full glory, such as Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg. Well, a bit of an oddball pick. We can find traditionalism in film sets and theme parks across Eurasia and the Americas. If you'd like to learn more about Hogsmeade and beauty as an example, I have a video on that too. Also, there are very nice Japanese and Chinese gardens in the Pacific, which are absolutely gorgeous. I'm not going to argue that we are undergoing a traditional renaissance, and that architecture today isn't utterly disgusting in most places. And sure, maybe these buildings do not compare to St. Peter's Basilica or Versailles, but I don't think they need to. Sure, some of the designs are a bit cliched, but they answer to the genuine hunger for beauty, one that is not found in these ugly high-rises made from glass and concrete in Western Sydney. Loving beautiful things and places doesn't make you shallow or misguided, and it certainly doesn't pertain to a specific political ideology, but it's also true that most advocates for traditional architecture probably do lean conservative, and that's fine. Living in modernity doesn't mean abandoning heritage. We ought to preserve the amazing buildings we have today and strive to build more beauty. What are your favourite architectural styles? Do you have a favourite medieval or Renaissance building? Comment below. I'd love to know your thoughts and start a discussion. Subscribe for frequent videos on history, literature, and culture. I also have a mailing list, creative writing classes, and a blog all linked below. Thank you for watching, and I'll certainly see you soon. Goodbye for now.